Hello, everyone. Welcome to Frontera's YouTube channel. I am Felicia Farley, the Marketing and Fundraising Coordinator, and with me today I have John Guerrero, Licensed Professional Counselor. We have a special short presentation for you on the impact of trauma on mental health, followed by a live Q&A session with John so that you may ask him any questions you have. If you're unsure whether or not you're watching live, look at the top corner of your screen, and if the red live icon is there, we are live. If not, you are viewing the replay and can still drop questions or comments in the chat and we will get back to you. All right. Wellness Uncorked is brought to you in partnership with the Texas Wine Auction and Frontera Healthcare Network. With grant funding from the Texas Wine Auction, we have been able to launch this innovative program to bring free group counseling classes, educational seminars, and health fairs to more individuals who work within the hospitality, service, and retail industries, as well as their families. At this time, I'm going to turn the show over to John so that we can get started.
Thank you very much, Felicia. I appreciate the introduction, and I am very glad to be able to do this video. This is our second one. If you didn't tune into last month's video on building resilience in the face of adversity, I strongly encourage you and just invite you to go back to our YouTube channel and find that. Really good discussion just about what resilience looks like, and a little bit of that plays into this discussion today about trauma. This is a kind of a heavier, weighty topic, probably not something that everyone loves talking about, but something that I really do believe is necessary. And here at Frontera, we've been trying to navigate this transition to becoming more trauma-informed in our care for patients. And so part of that is understanding that a lot of people who make up our communities have experienced some sort of traumatic event in their lives. And so this is a really important topic because today we'll talk a little bit about how those traumas or how those traumatic experiences impact us and how people's mental health or emotional health or relationships can be impacted by traumatic things that happen in their lives. And so first of all, just like I talked about, the impact of trauma on mental health, last month we talked about building resilience in the face of adversity. We started with the question, sort of a definition really. What is trauma? That's our first question today. And so to give you the answer to that, it's here on your screen. It says trauma is a physical, cognitive, and emotional response caused by a traumatic event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced as harmful or life-threatening. So before I move on from that, I want to just kind of talk about what each of those things means. Just kind of break down that definition from the CDC. So the first part, it says that it's a traumatic event. And so trauma is really our response to a traumatic event. We have in a little bit, we'll talk about how people in our world have experienced traumatic events, but trauma is a response to something like that. And so it says here that it can be a traumatic event, singular, this one-time event that took place in our lives at some point that caused us some emotional or psychological distress. The second part of that, though, it says that it could be a series of events. And so some of us have experienced something of that nature, where maybe it's more than just a one-time event or experience, but it's over the course of time, repeatedly, something has happened to us in our past. And we'll talk about in a minute the different categories of what that could look like. The third part is the circumstances. And so it could be that a person either growing up or just at different points in their lives have experienced difficult circumstances that have made living hard for them or that have been harmful or life-threatening for them. And so it's really important to kind of break down those three different types of traumatic experience: the single event, the series of events, or the set of circumstances that have been experienced by a person as harmful or life-threatening. According to the World Health Organization, about 70% of people worldwide will experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. That's a big number. And so 70% of people across the globe will have experienced a traumatic situation at some point in their lives, whether that's one of those singular events we talked about, whether it's repeated events, or whether it's just difficult circumstances that they've had to endure. Now, of those people, not everybody has a traumatic response. A statistic I heard before in a trauma therapy training was that something about only 20% of people worldwide who experience trauma actually go on to have trouble recovering from that trauma. That number is probably a little bit different, and we'll talk about how it looks in the American population here in a minute when you get into things like PTSD and official diagnosis. So just thinking about the fact that the majority of people, 70% of people in around us in our lives, even maybe us ourselves, have experienced some kind of traumatic event in our lifetime. And so now that we've talked about what trauma is, I think it's really important to talk about the different types of trauma and what can cause trauma responses. And so this is just a graphic that I found online that lists the different categories that exist of traumatic events. Again, these can be just a singular event that have happened one time to a person, or a series of events or situations that they've had to endure, or just circumstances in their lives that have built up over time. So you have the grief trauma. That would be sudden loss, maybe the loss of a child or a spouse or a friend, something that's tragic and sudden. You've got disaster trauma. So that could be natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, something that causes a significant loss, or later on a traumatic response that maybe is triggered when other disasters come up. We've got childhood trauma. I'm going to talk about this a little bit today in a little bit more detail. Childhood trauma being one of those big underlying issues for adult mental health problems, things that happen in a person's childhood, whether it's abuse, neglect, anything like that. The medical trauma. This one is not talked about, I think, very much, but things that people endure when they're in the hospital or when they have experiences where they come close to dying. Something traumatizes them when that has to do with their health. And then the abuse trauma. This goes into physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, relationship trauma. And this one, again, is not one that's talked about as much, but it just could be a traumatizing relationship. And maybe you can kind of use your imagination to think about what that might look like, or what might describe that. Then there's war trauma. And when people typically think about something like PTSD, I think their minds go to war trauma, people coming back from war, having experienced really difficult and traumatizing and tragic things on the other side of the world. And then the last thing is sexual trauma. And this goes along with that abuse or assault and things like that. And so again, a weighty, kind of heavy topic to think about, and nothing that really anyone wants to sit around and think about. But it's really important. And so as we're talking about the impact of these traumas on a person's mental health, I think it really comes down to when these things are unresolved, when they are creating psychological distress or emotional distress, or when they're interfering in our relationships or our day-to-day living and they're unresolved, that's when these things have to be dealt with. And that's what we do. Part of what we do here at Frontera. That's what good therapy is all about. We'll talk about that here in a minute. According to the National Center for PTSD, of those who experience traumatic events, any of those that we just talked about on the previous graphic, in the United States, about 6% of people who experience traumatic events will go on to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. That's PTSD, which is a serious response to traumatic events that can cause mental and emotional health problems years after the event. It's really important to note that not everybody who goes through a traumatic event ends up being diagnosed with something like PTSD, or ends up having mental or emotional health problems later on down the line. There are various factors that contribute to why that happens, though, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. What we do need to know is that the risk of those things happening is increased when there is trauma. And so while the majority of people recover in a healthy way, go on to live full and healthy lives after traumatic events, 6 out of every 100 people end up struggling pretty intensely sometimes. And so we kind of look at how to really address that, and also how to prevent that. According to an article from verywellmind.org, traumatic events can include things such as child abuse, child neglect, bullying, physical abuse, domestic violence, violence in the community, natural disasters, medical trauma, sexual abuse and sex trafficking, substance abuse, accidents, war, terrorism, traumatic grief, and even intergenerational trauma. And so again, 70% of people worldwide experience something like that, but only 6% of people in the United States will go on to develop symptoms of PTSD in response to that. So it can be really difficult to categorize trauma, and our reactions and responses to them can vary greatly. And so while the things that happen to us may be able to fit into a category, they may be able to fit into a box or a description. One thing that really can't be accurately described always or accurately predicted is how people respond to those things, how you handle those traumatic events in your life. In the late 90s, the CDC and a group called Kaiser Permanente conducted a study that has gone on to be known as the ACEs study, which stands for the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And in that study, what they did was they took a group of people, they tracked the behavioral, emotional, cognitive, and relational impact that traumatic events happened on adults who had come from, who had experienced those things in their childhood years. And so they did the study kind of following them and looking at the progression of problems in these areas if traumatic experiences happen in their childhood. Using the data from that research, the study demonstrated that trauma and adverse experiences during childhood are major risk factors for the leading causes of illness and death in the United States, as well as for poor quality of life. And what the study revealed is that the more adverse experiences a person has during their childhood years, the more likely they were to develop major problems later in life, whether they be physical problems, emotional, relationship problems, mental health problems. And so what are these adverse childhood experiences that contribute so radically to those future problems? In the ACEs study that they conducted in the 90s, what they decided was that these 5 categories of adverse experiences had a detrimental impact, or at least increased the risk of poor quality of life later on in life. Things like child abuse, neglect, domestic violence, household members abusing alcohol or drugs, or other traumatic stressors, which really is just kind of growing up in an environment that's stressful or overwhelming emotionally on a child. And so when you look at that, you kind of look at this official CDC study that examined the impact later in life that childhood trauma or traumatic events had on a person. In other words, traumatic events in childhood years increase the risk for poorer outcomes later in life. And they went on to say that these things included substance abuse, early initiation of sexual activity, sexually transmitted diseases, legal trouble or criminal activity, poor cognitive development, alcoholism, depression, and even suicide ideation or suicide attempts. And so you can see on this graphic the relationship that it shows here between early childhood trauma and the health and well-being that were problems that were experienced later in life. And so you see at the bottom those adverse childhood experiences, those ACEs, which led to social, emotional, and cognitive impairment, the adoption of higher health risk behaviors, disease, disability, and social problems, and then early death. Not a guarantee, but what it's showing is that it increases the likelihood of those things. It increases the risk of those things. And so you can see kind of just from this study, those detrimental effects that could potentially happen in a person's life because of the presence of traumatic situations in their early years. So from this study, it's pretty clear that traumatic events increase the risk of mental and emotional health problems. But the question is why, right? What causes this to happen? One explanation from the University of Northern Colorado is that when someone experiences a traumatic event or experiences extreme fear, which is a typical response of trauma, brain chemistry is altered and the brain begins to function differently. And so because the circuitry and the wiring of the brain is kind of reprogrammed and rewired, much like what happens in a traumatic brain injury, reactions begin to occur differently. Dangers are perceived in the brain when there aren't any. People may feel like they're reliving the traumatic experience. This is where people are triggered by reminders or associations of things. Flashbacks and reminders or memories may frequently occur. People may feel on edge or jumpy or fearful of bad things happening. There can be this increased anxiety about bad things happening in their lives. All of that stems from the impact that trauma has on the biology and the neurobiology of the body. Here's a quote from Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote an awesome book on trauma called The Body Keeps the Score. He says, "We've learned that trauma is not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's also the imprint left by that experience on mind, brain, and body. This imprint has ongoing consequences for how the human organism manages to survive in the present." He says trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. And so, as he talks about in his book, there have been all these studies done on the impact that trauma has on the actual brain itself. And because that's true, and because the brain becomes rewired, different consequences take place, whether it's the psychological responses to triggers or reminders, emotional reactivity, cognitive development, memories, nightmares, flashbacks. And so it's very clear to see from all of these studies that trauma does impact not just mental health, it impacts the brain as well. And so to answer the question originally, how does trauma impact mental health? The first thing I think we need to understand is that it really does affect the functioning of the brain. Memories are stored or distorted in our brains. Reactions can be altered. The perception of danger can persist long after the event has taken place. It doesn't matter how many years have gone by. The brain is rewired to be on alert and ready for harm. And if you think about always being in that state, on alert and ready for harm, that can really begin to impact and affect your relationships, your job performance, even your day-to-day living. Being in traffic, dealing with loud noises, being overstimulated can really begin to affect your reactions. All that because of how the brain becomes reprogrammed. The second thing here, though, on your list is that it increases the risk of harmful behaviors later in life. So we talked about that with the ACEs study, that it doesn't guarantee that harmful behaviors will result after the traumatic event, but it increases the risk of those things. So when people are left with that imprint that Bessel van der Kolk talks about, that imprint of those traumatic memories, sometimes they find themselves trying to cope with those things with activities or substances or things that will numb the pain or try to at least erase or block out the memory. And that can, not always, but it can include things like drugs or alcohol or sex or food, different things like that, which can then go on to cause its own set of problems behaviorally and with relationships and with jobs. And so what you see is individuals who are having trouble moving on from that trauma, finding their own ways to either self-medicate or to cope. And of course, I don't want to generalize or speak too generally about people who go through trauma. It doesn't always happen that way, but it increases the likelihood of that happening, of finding our own ways to cope, which are not always the best or most helpful or healthy ways to cope. The third thing here on the list is that it can lead to depression and anxiety that are really a mask for PTSD. As I talked about earlier, 6% of people in the United States who have experienced a traumatic event go on to develop symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Often people think that they're struggling just with depression or just with anxiety, but depression and anxiety can often be a mask for the PTSD. And usually when you're able to treat the trauma, you end up treating the depression and the anxiety, and all those problems go away along with it. And so, it can mask itself as having an anxiety disorder, having panic attacks, having depressive disorder, or just kind of being subject to frequent depression. But beneath the symptoms, though, is often this trauma that has largely been unresolved. And so to wrap that up and kind of thinking about, okay, this clearly has an impact on the brain. It clearly has an impact on behavioral health and mental health. It clearly has an impact on our relationships and sometimes even our day-to-day living. So if all this is true, then what can actually be done about it? What are we supposed to do about that? And I think there are really two parts to the response. Number one is about prevention. And so prevention is key. We need to be doing all we can to help prevent the traumas or the traumatic events that end up creating those harmful consequences later in life. Here's another quote from Bessel van der Kolk from his book. He says, as the ACE study has shown, those adverse childhood experiences, child abuse and neglect is the single most preventable cause of mental illness, the single most common cause of drug and alcohol abuse, and a significant contributor to leading causes of death, such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, stroke, and suicide. So helping prevent childhood trauma so that people can become healthy adults free from the harmful repercussions of traumatic events in their younger years is going to be the first step in helping to ensure that those traumas don't follow people years down the road. We can, as a society, as a culture, as a community, as families, as educators, as mental health practitioners, as medical providers, as people just looking out for each other, can work together to help prevent those traumatic situations by helping prevent things like childhood trauma. Second thing, though, is effective treatment. Because the thing is, not everything can be prevented, and not everything has been prevented, right? And probably somebody watching this live stream, or somebody walking into our clinics, or somebody in our families, or even us ourselves, we've been through a trauma, we've experienced a traumatic event, we're dealing with the traumatic response to that, and so now we're left with this need for healing. I found this quote from Michelle Rosenthal. She said, "Trauma creates change you don't choose. Healing is about creating change you do choose." So if you see here on your screen, it says, left untreated, trauma can continue to damage mental health, impact relationships, and interrupt healthy day-to-day living. And so it's important to seek effective treatment to resolve the traumas of the past and discover a way to heal. And there are lots of different ways to do that, whether it's through talk therapy, whether it's through other activities, it's through healthy relationships, it's through support groups, or whatever the case may be, whatever the need is, it's about effectively dealing with that. I often use this quote from Freud, who said, basically, I'll summarize, that avoidance is what leads to pathology. And so I tell people all the time, the thing that we avoid doesn't actually ever go away. It just continues, it persists, it keeps coming back to haunt us. And so one of the best ways to deal with trauma is to confront it. And that's painful and uncomfortable. And most people would probably, in their minds, they think, I'd be happy to just kind of live my life and just forget all about that. And that may work for a while until it doesn't. And so I think it's really helpful, and I say this as a mental health practitioner, to confront, to deal with, to face the trauma and find a way to heal from it in order to be able to live healthy moving forward. And so my last slide here is just some resources and some treatment methods that are really more well-known and I think really effective tools to help with trauma. The first one is the book that I've quoted from today, The Body Keeps the Score. Not an easy or light read. You're not going to read it while you're sitting on the beach. It's pretty heavy. But Bessel van der Kolk is one of the world's leading experts on trauma. And he talks in the first half of the book about that, just the neurobiology of trauma. And then he goes into the behavioral repercussions. And the last part talks about some therapeutic techniques that can kind of help resolve trauma. One thing he recommends here is EMDR, which is a type of therapy that is a mixture of eye movements, processing, talk therapy. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a phenomenal therapy approach for trauma. We've seen a lot of success with this in the past, and it's been highly recommended by trauma experts like Bessel van der Kolk. Another one, though, is cognitive processing therapy, which is more of a cognitive talk therapy approach to handling trauma. And so it gives a person an opportunity to really identify the thing that has traumatized them and look at the impact that it has had on them in terms of their beliefs or their perceptions about themselves or about the world or about other people, and then takes those perceptions and those beliefs and processes them and kind of breaks them down and uses a lot of Socratic questioning to change the beliefs, to change the guiding or the fundamental views or perceptions that are governing a lot of their behaviors and a lot of their feelings. And so any of these things can be helpful in helping to deal with trauma. As I said, if it's not dealt with, if it's not treated, if it's always avoided, it doesn't really ever go away. And so I strongly just kind of recommend and encourage. I know this is a real short talk and a real quick dive into a really big topic, but I really encourage you, reach out. Contact us here at Frontera if this applies to you or someone that you know, or if you want just additional resources or have any questions about how to deal with trauma in your life. So I think that sums it up for my talk for today. I guess we'll see if we have any questions at all.
Thank you, John, for being our presenter today. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat now and we'll take your questions. If you like what you heard today or have a request for a future topic, please feel free to leave your comments in the chat as well. We'd love to hear from you. Alrighty. Well, are you ready to begin your mental health journey? If you would like further information on the Wellness Uncorked program or to schedule an appointment with one of our licensed professional counselors, please contact us by scheduling an appointment by calling 325-597-0102 or visit fronterahn.org. Frontera offers counseling services in person and virtually. As always, please subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you never miss a notification when we go live and to learn more about the importance of mental health.